Good evening. It looks like you just set out the agenda for me. That is one of the issues we're going to talk about, road tolls. And let's just talk about transit, Mr. Mayor, because it was in 54 they opened up the Yonge Street TTC, 66 Bloor Street, and since then not an awful lot has been done until you become mayor. So you're making a lot of changes to the city, but it's at a price. Let's just talk about tolls. You have to pay for that somehow.
Well, I mean, I had a choice as to how to pay. The one thing I was not prepared to do was to say, well, let's just kick this down the road, because the reason we haven't opened a new transit station in Toronto for 14 years is because nobody would answer the question, with all these different lines we know we have to build, how are we going to pay for it? So I went through a difficult exercise in choosing, and I had the alternative of a massive property tax increase, 10%. And I just said no to that because I felt that would hurt more people. So I came upon road tolls, which will raise $200 million a year, and we'll do it partly from the pockets. Well, first of all, it's a user fee, which I think is fair. But secondly, it's partly from the pockets of people who use those roads, who live in 905 outside of Toronto and don't at present contribute anything to the cost of keeping those roads up or building transit, at least not directly. And so I think building the transit to fix the roads will get these people to contribute, and we'll move ahead and actually get something done.
Well, let's talk about other changes to the city, Mr. Mayor, because you've been in office for over a year and a half now, and you're bringing about changes to the transit. Are you happy with the changes you've brought about so far?
Well, I'm happy that we're making progress. At least now we've answered the question, how do you pay for some of this? We have put a substantial sum of money with our partners at the province into the relief line, which people name as the #1 priority. We're moving ahead with Smart Track. We've had several council approvals now for each step of that, and there's actually construction work underway in North Scarborough to begin Smart Track. We're going to be looking at people to build the stations early next year, so this is really happening. We've made substantial additional investments in transit service, increased bus service and so on. The one probably, there's a couple of little sore points, and they're not little. One big sore point is the streetcars that haven't been delivered by Bombardier. That's causing a lot of problems for people. And the second has been some of the uneven performance of Presto as we make the conversion to that. And we're going to work very hard on those things.
Let's talk about an article in one of the papers this morning about the TTC on transit again. There's a suggestion that while there is a seniors benefit now, the suggestion that, well, the seniors all have money and they shouldn't get this benefit for TTC fares.
Well, I can tell you we are bringing in something called the Fair Pass, F-A-I-R, which is meant to help low-income people with transit. It's been decades under discussion.
So it won't be just age, it'll be income.
Yes, it'll be income, but I can tell you right now, any tampering with the arrangements made for senior citizens is not something I'm interested in looking at. Seniors have paid their dues, and I think what we have to do is find a way to finance this Fair Pass for low-income people, which will include a lot of seniors, and do that without making any significant alteration at all to the arrangements in place for decades for senior citizens.
So those are some of the changes you're bringing about to this city. Let's just talk about one of the changes that is happening, notwithstanding politicians, and it's the increase in guns on the street and the increase in shootings and murders. And people who have lived in Toronto for a number of years are saying, this is a change, and what can we do about it? How do you answer them?
Well, I think the first thing, there's two things you have to do. One is get at the gang activity, and that is going to be done by finding ways to not have people end up going to prison at age 18 because they dropped out of school and got in with a bad lot, and then they keep going to prison over and over again and coming out and settling scores with people. So we've got to get at that. But the second thing is dealing with the guns. And the guns are 50-50 according to the police statistics. 50% come over the border, and we're getting help from the federal government on staunching that flow of guns. But the other half are guns that are bought sometimes by people who are legally entitled to buy them, but they're going in and buying 10, and under the rules they're buying them within the four corners of the law, but then they are reselling them to people who are involved with the criminal element. And I wrote to the Minister of Community Safety this past week to say, and he's been very cooperative by the way, but to say we have to staunch this flow. And I got some blowback, frankly, from people in the sort of gun community who said, why are you going to tamper with people who are legal gun owners? And I said, well, they're not legal gun owners as far as I'm concerned if they're going to buy 10 guns. I can't even imagine why anybody would buy 10 guns. But
well, I know why. They're going to resell them.
Well, I mean, there are a few bona fide collectors, and there are a few bona fide target, shooters who are training for the Olympics and so on, but very few. And I think that those people, we can find who they are and identify them quite easily, but other people who go in to buy 10 guns are up to something, and I want to sort of nail that down and stop that from happening, because those guns are ending up on the street. The police tell me, I'm not making this up, they tell me those guns are ending up on the street street in criminal activity with people being shot in this city, and I don't think we can put up with that.
I think that's stunning news. That most people know there are tight gun control laws in Canada, but it's stunning what you're telling our audience right now, that if you have the paperwork, you can go into a shop, a gun store, and buy 10 revolvers, knowing darn well if they're all the same, you're not going to want to have 10 revolvers for legitimate use.
Absolutely. I mean, I have no trouble with a person following the law, but anybody, as far as I'm concerned, anybody who goes in and buys more than one gun, there should be a flag that goes up, and the police or somebody from the firearms, people should pay them a visit and say, well, now, Mr. LeDrew, why have you bought all these guns? Where are they? Could you show us where you've stored them? Because there are strict rules on all of that. And if they don't have the right answers, then quite frankly, we should be doing something about that, because those are the guns that are ending up on our streets, killing people that live in Toronto, or injuring them, or just being fired off or brandished, and we have no place for that here.
Let's talk about 2017, because people know now what you've done in 2016. It's been transit and other issues dealing with getting around this city, and also the tolls. Where do you want to go in 2017? What do you want to achieve? What do you want to have a year from now when we're talking what you've done?
I want you to be able to stand here and acknowledge when I say that we've moved every one of the transit projects ahead so that they're on schedule, they're actually happening. And it's a long process. You have to design it, you have to then build it, you have to finance it. But I want it to be said that we've moved all of those transit projects ahead. I want it to be said that we have taken additional steps through the 10 worst intersections we're looking at, and the traffic blitzes and all those kinds of things to move traffic in the city better and have it flow better. The issue that I think is the one that I'm going to be paying even more attention to in 2017, and I want it to be said that I did and that I got something done, is housing. I think there are more and more people who are really struggling in this city to afford to live here, especially people who are in modest income jobs, and I think that's a problem for us, a long-term problem. And so I want to get the other governments back into the housing issue, because they've been backing away from it, and I think there are signs the federal government might come forward, but we need more affordable rental housing in particular in Toronto, and I want you to be able to stand here next year and acknowledge that we've made some significant progress in that regard as we move forward.
Will you be moving ahead with that initiative that you've started this year about selling off vacant city land that's been sitting there? In one case, I think it was in the fall, you said it's been 20 years empty, we've owned it and done nothing with it.
Yeah, it's not even a matter of selling it off, though, Stephen. What we're saying is that land is available, and we could sell it to somebody for affordable housing, but what we're often doing is partnering with people and saying, we'll put up the land for $1, keep ownership of it, but you're going to build affordable housing on it. And when we've done it 2 or 3 times since I've been the mayor, we've had tremendous response, and there are hundreds of units that are now under construction or soon to be under construction of affordable housing. And we have 12 more pieces of land. We've used 3. We have 12 more we've offered up to the private sector to say, come and build affordable housing. We will contribute our land to the pot. And I think that's something we're going to have to do more of, as well as streamlining approval of affordable housing, and also just insisting to our friends in the development community. When I say our friends, they're people who are building housing we need in the city, but we're going to have to say to them, a portion of that is going to have to be affordable housing. You have to include that or do it some other place, but you've got to do it.
I have time for one more question. Is something else you're bringing about in the city? You introduced your new Commissioner of Transportation this week, and people are saying, well, it's that war on cars again. You and I have spoken about the transit. How about bikes and cars? I mean, you're changing this city.
I am doing this the sensible way, though, which is not, I would never lead a war on cars, because it would be counterproductive and ridiculous in the context of a balanced transportation system I want to have, where cars and trucks and transit vehicles can move on the roads, but there's also room for people who wish to cycle and walk safely. And so what we're doing is a balanced program to make sure there is room for all those people on our roads, and we're going to proceed ahead with that, and we're going to fix the Gardiner. I mean, if I was trying to say people shouldn't drive cars, why would we be investing money to fix the Gardiner? So I just think this is divisive rhetoric that is coming from people who want to stir up trouble. I'm actually trying to bring the city together, acknowledge that in a 21st century city, people do want to bike, people do want to walk. We should want them to do that. We should want them to take transit so fewer people have to take their cars, but that people will continue to drive cars, and we're going to make sure that that traffic flows so it's safe and so people can get to where they need to go.
And now I'm definitely out of time. One last question. Do you still like the job?
Oh, yeah, sure. It's interesting, and there are days when you sort of, roll your eyes a little bit, but it's a very challenging and interesting job, and I love the city.
It's a great city. Thanks very much.
to sound like I just accept it as being sort of the way it's going to be and we're going to do nothing about it. But I do remind myself all the time, as I would remind your viewers, it's a marketplace. And so the law of supply and demand is obviously having an impact here. And so from our end, there's not much we can do to affect demand. That's a function of growth in the city, which is good. It's a function of immigration to the country, which is good. A lot of those people are choosing to come to the Toronto area. So I think that what I've tried to focus my attention on is the one area that I should be focusing it on, which is the supply, in particular, of affordable rental housing. Because I think that, while you talked about ownership prices and so on, and that's obviously of keen interest to and of concern to young people and people of all ages, I think the one thing that we have to do to make sure that people can afford to live and work here is to increase the supply of affordable rental housing, and we're working very hard to do that, really by putting incentives in front of the private sector.
Well, I want to talk about the demand piece for 1 minute, because BC introduced this foreign homebuyer tax over the past year, and since then we've seen home sales in Vancouver fall and home sales in Toronto lift. Now it's been a few months that we had to digest that. Are we able to draw a line between that move by BC and the increases that we've seen in Toronto?
Well, first of all, I would say that the Vancouver and Toronto housing markets are quite different, and we're really working hard to try and understand the differences between the two, and we're working with the City of Vancouver and the Government of BC and the Government of Canada to do that. But what you mentioned is correct. The number of sales went down in Vancouver, but interestingly enough, in the light of this tax, the prices went up. And so if the whole idea here is to dampen down the increase in prices, then the jury would still be out at best on whether or not that tax had the desired effect. And which is why I haven't sort of leapt into saying something that might be politically very popular, which is to say, well, I too will support such a tax in Toronto, because I'm not sure if you're really addressing, what the issue is in the minds of people, namely the big increases in prices, which you referred to at the outset, that tool being used in BC is actually working. So I just think the most important thing to do or not to do when you're dealing with something like the housing pricing market is not to act precipitously, not to act quickly, not to act for political reasons, but to do things that are based on facts that will be effective. And so in that regard, I endorse some of the things that have been done on a very careful basis by the federal government with regard to mortgage rules, because I think that has, the effect of just making sure that we try as best we can to have some influence on the prices in the market, but otherwise you shouldn't act with haste, especially not for political reasons.
Well, what about the fear that some people had that Vancouver's move or BC's move to introduce that foreign homebuyer tax would sort of incentivize foreign homebuyers to leapfrog over into the Toronto market? Have we had enough time to assess whether that's happening?
I would say no. I mean, I think that if you looked at what people were telling me, and we were, again, talking to the Government of Ontario and talking to people in the development community here and so on, that there wasn't any evidence that there was a huge problem, if I can call it that in quotation marks, with respect to foreign buyers somehow artificially inflating the housing market in Toronto. There were people who were investing in real estate in Toronto who were either foreign people from another country or people who are moving here from another country. But I think what we're trying to do is responsibly understand what's going on in this market, which is a market that is driven, I think, largely in terms of its pricing by dynamic growth that is happening here, confidence in Toronto as a global center. I think one might argue there's as much to do with things that are happening in the United States that are driving some of that demand and interest in Toronto and world instability as some particular circumstance that just says there's a group of people driving up prices here. So I just think it's important to understand these things. It's not to minimize the fact that I'm sure it's a scary proposition for a young person wanting to buy a house to see the kinds of prices that we're seeing. But the worst thing we could do for them and the worst thing we could do for the marketplace here and its long-term health is to act in a hasty manner, to do something that's politically sexy, but that is actually not going to be effective and may even be less than responsible.
I saw a survey that suggested that half of home buyers in Toronto still expect to get a detached home, which seems to be pretty much outside the realm of possibility for a lot of people. Do you think that Torontonians need to adjust their expectations a bit with detached versus condo versus townhouse?
I don't want to say that because, the first and foremost thing I want to say is that I don't want to say to a whole generation of people in Toronto, you can't live here in any place. There's no rental for you, there's no multi-unit condo type accommodation, and you certainly can't buy a detached home. I do not want to say that because I think that, again, preservation of the health of this city going forward is going to depend on people being able to live here and work here. But I think that the fact that these houses are continuing to sell to people, albeit at inflated prices, indicates that there are still people buying them. And so there may be changes in the use of some of that housing going forward. I don't really know, but the bottom line is that we're watching it very carefully. I am concerned about it as per what I just said in terms of people being able to live in this city and work here, which is important. But I will not be stampeded as the mayor into calling for other governments or even taking action on our own to do things that are not going to be effective and fair.